This is Walter Bosley, and I'll be reading a selection from Pirates and the Lost Templar Fleet, the Secret Naval War Between the Knights Templar and the Vatican, by David Hatcher Childress. Chapter 8, Pirates, Privateers, and the War with the Vatican. Today, piracy has taken on different connotations from the early days of naval war between the remnants of the Knights Templar and the Vatican. As they say in this modern era of national struggles, you are a freedom fighter or a terrorist, depending upon whose side you are on and who wins the war. In those early days, the war between the Vatican and the Lost Templar Fleet meant that the Templar ships flew their flags with pride, the Jolly Roger and other Masonic Templar flags. Some Templar ships, like those in Portugal, still flew the Templar flag. These indeed were the ships that Christopher Columbus sailed in for the Spanish crown. The Papal line of demarcation of 1493. As soon as news of Columbus's successful voyage reached Europe, the Spanish monarchs moved to secure their new trade route. Since the days of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portugal had been actively exploring and developing sea trade with new lands. Throughout the 15th century, Portuguese expeditions reached farther down the coast of Africa and into the Atlantic. The interests of Spain and Portugal now collided head-on. Since both countries were Catholic, the Pope was petitioned to decide the territorial conflict, as had been done in the past. In this case, the Pope was Alexander VI. Born Rodrigo de Borja to a prominent family of Valencia, Spain, he was the nephew of Pope Callistus III. Rodrigo had several illegitimate children by his mistress Venanza Catani. Upon his installation as pope, his son Cesare Borgia took over the direction of his affairs. The political maneuvering, corruption, and greed of this administration was unequaled. Moral laxity and unconcern for the spiritual guidance of the church were the norm. Cesare is said to be the model for Machiavelli's prince. Cesare's sister, Lucretia Borgia, is well known in her own right. When called upon to settle the dispute between Spain and Portugal, Alexander VI issued a papal bull which divided the world up between the two countries. The Pope maintained that this would advance the cause of Christ. Said the bull in part, quoting, "Among other works well pleasing to the divine majesty and cherished of our heart, this assuredly ranks highest, that in our times especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. We have indeed learned that you, who for a long time had intended to seek out and discover certain islands and mainlands remote and unknown and not hitherto discovered by others, to the end that you might bring to the worship of our Redeemer and the profession of the Catholic faith their residents and inhabitants." End quote. Since there is evidence that the recent Spanish voyage did not even include a Catholic priest, the motivation of the countries in the dispute could be better interpreted as to discover new lands and usurp their riches. Perhaps this was a tacit understanding, since the Pope would certainly see his share. Unsurprisingly, the Pope's decision slightly favored Spain. Basically, a line was drawn which ran from pole to pole, 100 leagues west of the Azores. Anything to the east of it belonged to Portugal, anything to the west belonged to Spain. This was appealed by Portugal, and the line was moved further west, which had the so-called unintended effect of landing the easternmost part of Brazil in Portugal's territory, sanctioning the colonization of that land by the Portuguese. Obviously, the papal bull was utterly politically incorrect vis-a-vis the rights of indigenous peoples of lands around the world to their own sovereignty and religious practice, but it also consummately ignored other European sea powers, and for their part, England, France, and the Netherlands ignored the papal bull. If anything, it served as a wake-up call to these countries that Spain and Portugal had a leg up on them in the race to leave the Dark Ages behind. The age of discovery and colonization and accumulation of foreign wealth began in earnest. The origin of privateering. According to the 1997 Grolier Encyclopedia, the definition of privateering is as follows. Privateering was the practice by which governments employed privately owned vessels to capture enemy commerce during wartime. Motivated by the profits made by such captures, privateers held licenses called letters of marque and reprisal, and their attacks were limited to vessels of nations at war with the country issuing their commissions. Privateering differed from piracy mainly because of those licenses and limitations. Although privateers existed from at least the 13th century and into the 19th, the heyday of privateering was from the 16th to the 18th century. Indeed, the origin of privateering was the secret war between the Templars and the Vatican and the Pope's allies. This meant that privateers were mainly English, Scottish, or American ships. Some were Dutch or French, and these privateers were typically Masons. The targets for privateers were almost exclusively Spanish or French ships, or Muslim ships plying the Mediterranean or Indian Ocean. As the next century or two loped along in Europe and the New World, a dizzying interplay of politics and religion resulted in an ever-changing kaleidoscope of alliances and animosities. Since the French Templar families had left France at the time of the suppression of the Templars and gone largely to England and Scotland, France had returned to the secure fold of the Vatican. The Merovingian family of so-called Holy Blood had long since ceased to rule, and in the 16th and 17th centuries, France was almost continually at war with England. This made French ships, as well as Spanish and some Portuguese, the target of pirate and privateer attacks. Some pirates, indeed, were French, and I like to think that some of these pirates were Templar Mason remnants who took a certain pleasure in attacking the treasure-laden ships and ports in the Vatican's part of the New World. So, privateers differed from pirates in that they, in theory, had some sort of official commission to go out and attack certain ships of enemy countries. Always difficult to control, privateers often lapsed into piracy. By 1500, international agreements limited their illegalities, requiring all seizures to be confirmed by admiralty courts and thus distinguishing pirate from privateer. Gradually, privateering operations were carefully regulated, and by 1740, privateering was an accepted area of business investment. When national navies were small, privateers could effectively injure an enemy at little cost to the licensing power. All Western European nations, especially weaker naval powers, employed this means of destroying enemy trade. Originating in Europe, it eventually spread throughout the world, reaching great vogue in the Caribbean and along the North American coast. Later, after Magellan and Drake had circumnavigated the world and the Spanish galleons began plying the Pacific Ocean from Acapulco to the Philippines, piracy and privateering spread to the Pacific coast of the New World and to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Madagascar became a major pirate area, a large and ungoverned island that lay perfectly in the sea lanes between India and the Cape route to Europe. Southeast Asia today is still a hotbed of piracy, though they are not in any way a remnant of the Templar fleet, and piracy still exists along the wild Pacific coasts of Ecuador, Colombia, and Panama. Templar Scotland Revisited. First, let us have a quick recap of Scottish history leading from the Templar arrival starting in 1307 to the creation of the United Kingdom. Scottish kings were often having disputes with the English, which occasionally led to war and ultimately the paying of homage to English kings based in York. In 1174, for example, William the Lion did homage to Henry II of England for all his dominions, although he later secured cancellation of this obligation. After the deaths of Alexander III and his heiress Margaret, Maid of Norway, King Edward I of England claimed suzerainty over Scotland and picked John de Balliol from rival claimants as the Scottish king. When John attempted to assert his independence in 1296, Edward imposed direct English rule. The Scots, led first by Sir William Wallace and later by Robert the Bruce, who was crowned king as Robert I in 1306, revolted and finally defeated the English in the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, in which we have said the Knights Templar took part and Scotland retained its independence from England. But later, during the long reign of David II, the English partially re-established control, though they were distracted by the 100 Years' War with France, Scotland's ally since 1295. David was succeeded in Scotland by his nephew Robert II, the first Stuart monarch. He and his successors, Robert III, James I, James II, James III, James IV, and James V, faced persistent civil strife and continued interference from and war with England. After the death in 1542 of James V, Scotland was ruled by his widow, Mary de Guise, as regent for her young daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. During this period, the Reformation took root in Scotland, gathering strength as a result of the political opposition to the French regent, the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, who returned to Scotland from France in 1561, fell victim to the religious and political conflicts. Forced to abdicate in 1567, she fled to England, where she was imprisoned and later executed by Elizabeth I. Nonetheless, her son James VI of Scotland succeeded Elizabeth on the English throne as James I in 1603. Although united under a single crown, Scotland and England remained separate states for another century. The Scottish Presbyterians resisted the efforts of the next monarch, King Charles I, to impose episcopacy in Scotland, and ultimately their rebellion brought about the execution of the king in 1649 and a civil war in England. It had now been hundreds of years since the suppression of the Templars, and entirely new countries had been created with new alliances. Parts of the Templar fleet, which had become the Navy of Scotland, and its new inheritors, became Masonic English and Dutch privateers who attacked Spanish and French ships that were allied with the Vatican. The Templar tradition infiltrated England and the North American colonies under the guise of Masonry. There were two main forms of Scottish Free Rite Masonry and New York Rite Masonry. Sir Dragon and the Masonic Lodge of Privateers. What is curious in our history of the Lost Templar fleet is that many of the pirates and privateers that were to help in the creation of the United States were also Masons. Though it is impossible to prove that all these men were Masons, it was, after all, a secret society, we know that many of them were. The Elizabethan wars between Spain and England and other countries led to a new outbreak of so-called pirate attacks in the 16th century. Galleons carrying treasure from America to Spain were tempting targets for seafaring raiders. These chartered privateers and pirates had names such as the Sea Dogs of England, the Sea Beggars of the Netherlands, and the Sea Wolves of France. They intercepted countless Spanish vessels, including in 1521 a ship laden with riches from Hernán Cortés's Mexican expedition. By the late 16th century, tempted by the booty available, some sea rovers, including Sir John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake, attacked Spanish colonies in America. By the 17th century, pirates had established Caribbean bases at St. Christopher's, Jamaica, Tortuga, and other points. The Spanish dominated the Caribbean and the New World at this time, but it was up to the Templar Navy in the guise of Masonic privateers to turn the tide for the Scottish and English and their secret Templar masters. This is the era of adventure on the high seas that is depicted in pirate movies such as Roman Polanski's Pirates, the Gina Davis film Cutthroat Island, and Disney's recent Pirates of the Caribbean series. It was during this romantic era that Sir Henry Morgan sacked and pillaged along the Spanish Main and was later the governor of Jamaica, where he then tried to control piracy. In proof that there was some genuine romance to this life of privateering for the crown of the United Kingdom, even women were attracted to the pirate life. Female pirates such as Anne Bonny and Mary Read participated in many coastal raids and had their own pirate crews. The most notable Masonic privateer of all time is Sir Francis Drake. Drake, whose name means dragon, was the most famous English seaman of the Elizabethan age, and is best known for his exploits against the Spanish and his circumnavigation of the world. Drake was born in Devonshire about 1541 to a poor, staunchly Protestant farming family. He went to sea as a youth, aided by his relations, the Hawkins family of Plymouth. He took part in a slave-trading expedition to the Cape Verde Islands and the West Indies in 1566. The next year, he sailed under John Hawkins on an expedition that was attacked by the Spanish at San Juan de Ulua, today's Veracruz, Mexico. Only the ships commanded by Hawkins and Drake escaped. Drake scouted the Panama region in 1570 and returned there the next year, when he bombarded several coastal cities and captured much gold and silver. Temporary duty in Ireland followed. The deterioration of relations with Spain led Queen Elizabeth I to back an expedition to sail around the world, a feat that had been accomplished only once before by a Spanish expedition under Ferdinand Magellan. Drake was placed in charge of 5 small ships and about 160 men and left Plymouth in December of 1577. The voyage was a difficult one. Drake had to put down a mutiny off the Patagonian coast and abandon 2 small store ships. It took 16 days to pass through the Strait of Magellan. One ship abandoned the quest and returned to England, and another disappeared during a storm. Thus, by the time he reached the Pacific, Drake was left with only one ship, the Golden Hind. He traveled up the coasts of Chile and Peru, raiding Spanish shipping, and sailed far to the north before returning south to touch land in the San Francisco area. He claimed the surrounding region for England and named it New Albion. Drake then set off across the Pacific. He traded in the Spice Islands and signed treaties with local rulers. He returned to England via the Indian Ocean and the Cape of Good Hope, reaching Plymouth on September 20th, 1580, laden with treasure and spices. For his accomplishments, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I. Drake served as mayor of Plymouth for some years. In 1585, however, he was given command of a large fleet that sacked Vigo in Spain, then crossed the Atlantic to capture and plunder Cartagena and Santo Domingo and to destroy St. Augustine in Florida. In 1587, he led a raid on Cadiz that destroyed the stores and many of the ships of the Spanish fleet. This exploit delayed the attack on England by the Spanish Armada for a year. Drake played a major role in the successful English defense against the Armada in 1588 and was acclaimed as England's hero. But his forces were defeated at Lisbon in 1589, and for some years he remained in Plymouth. A final voyage to the West Indies, begun in 1595, was totally unsuccessful. Drake died off the coast of Panama on January 28, 1596. Drake's cousin, Sir John Hawkins, was another famous Masonic privateer. Hawkins, born in 1532, was a famous English naval commander of the Elizabethan era. Born into a family of seafarers at Plymouth, he made his earliest voyages to the Canary Islands as a young man. He married Catherine Gunson, whose father was a treasurer of the Navy, in 1559. After Gonson's death, Hawkins assumed the post and introduced notable improvements in shipbuilding and naval administration. Between 1562 and 1569, Hawkins led 3 expeditions in which black slaves were taken from Africa for sale to Spanish colonies in the West Indies. On the 3rd voyage, 1567-69, in which his kinsman Francis Drake took part, he was involved in a major battle with a Spanish fleet at San Juan de Ulua off the coast of Mexico, and lost many of his men and ships. Hawkins commanded a portion of the English fleet that defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. He died at sea on an unsuccessful expedition to the West Indies. Drake died during the same expedition. In the next century, the most famous Masonic privateer was the Welsh adventurer Sir Henry Morgan. Morgan was one of the buccaneers who, with the unofficial support of the English government, preyed on Spanish shipping and colonies in the Caribbean. In 1668, he captured Puerto Príncipe, now Camagüey, Cuba, and sacked Portobello, now in Panama. He raided Maracaibo, now in Venezuela, in 1669. His spectacular capture of the city of Panama in 1671 was marked by great brutality and debauchery. Afterward, much of the booty was lost, and Morgan's crew claimed that he had cheated them. Captured and sent back to England in 1672 to answer piracy charges, Morgan was treated like a hero, knighted, and appointed lieutenant governor of Jamaica, where he lived quietly thereafter. Such successes against the Spanish colonies in America were praised from tavern to tavern along the coast of New England, and the romance and lure of piracy and privateering pervaded the English, Scottish, Dutch, and other colonists. There was nothing shameful in the acts of these privateers. In fact, they were heroes. But the era of royally commissioned pirates was coming to an end. England was now a powerful nation with a large navy thanks to the former Templar fleet and the successful union of Scotland and England. Support of privateering begins to look a lot less attractive when you are the one with the most to lose by it. This is Walter Bosley, and I've just read a selection from Pirates and the Lost Templar Fleet by David Hatcher Childress.